So yeah, welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time at one of these sessions. We kicked off last week where I sort of laid out the sort of groundwork, the foundation that we'll be exploring. And hello, whatever works. For those watching the video later, Kate has just entered the room. One of the things we said at the last session, this came out of the group's discussion, is that we want to take time to really understand what the Bible says about the topic of sexuality and gender and relationships. We want to understand what it meant then, when it was written, recognizing that was thousands of years ago in a totally different culture. We want to know what they were getting at then and what it means for us today. That's the challenge we're setting ourselves. And we're going to engage with some of that this afternoon with a focus on three particular Old Testament passages, two of which we referred to last time and one which we didn't. We're going to look again at Genesis 1:27. We'll look briefly at Genesis 19, which contains a story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we'll pick up on Leviticus 18:22. And briefly on the Sodom and Gomorrah story, I don't think it's relevant to what we're talking about, but some people do, so I wanted to address that. And as I say, I'm going to share some thoughts and there'll be opportunity to discuss. So that's our plan for this afternoon. So let's kick off. Genesis 1:27. We're also going to pick up 28. This is what it says. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And I spoke about this verse last week, but I was focusing on the idea of humanity being made in God's image, that we are image bearers, and that this should affect how we think about and treat everyone that we meet. But this afternoon, I want to pick up on a different phrase, where it says, male and female, he created them. And this is the first time sexuality is mentioned in the Bible. The animals obviously have been created before, but they're simply spoken of as being made after their kind. The sexual nature of the animal kingdom is recognized later in Genesis 6:19 as part of the flood story. Sexuality and gender is not part of God's nature, but it's clearly his intention for those who will bear his image. Part of his will for them as they live in community together. And as part of that, their relationships will produce children. Be fruitful and increase in number. And so according to the creation account, human beings exist with two different and complementary sexual identities and functions. And this provides a platform for all the positive comments made throughout the Bible about men and women living together in the state of marriage. It was something Jesus recognized and affirmed when being asked about divorce, where in Matthew 19:4-6, he responds to people and says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And there Jesus is picking up from those words in Genesis 1 and also some words at the end of Genesis 2. And it is straightforward to go from here to the conclusion that the only God-approved form of marriage is between a man and a woman with the complementarity they bring to that union. And it's important we take this seriously. Is that what this phrase means? Or are there other ways of thinking about it? I'm aware of three approaches people have taken when trying to argue it does not mean that this is the only valid form of marriage, the only way that people can live together in an intimate relationship. I'm going to briefly mention them, and then there'll be opportunity to talk about them later, and you'll see what you think. One is to suggest that the creation narrative in Genesis 1 is speaking about the majority situation. And it's not talking about all the variations that might be legitimately possible. And that this is in keeping with the high-level sweeping statements that are made in Genesis 1. And if you look at the creation story, it says that there are creatures that live on water, in water, I guess, creatures that lived on the land and birds that flew. There's those categories. But it doesn't address amphibians, for example, which can live both in land and on water. And so the argument goes that not all options for human relationships were spelled out either. Another argument recognizes that these texts were written a long time ago for a specific purpose, when the level of understanding about different expressions of sexuality were much less than today. Not that there was no awareness of different behaviors, but we need to recognize that our current 21st century understanding and ideas regarding sexual orientation, for example, did not develop until late 19th or early 20th century. So there was no reason, no basis for these ideas to be introduced in the creation story. Even if we think about same-sex marriage, which is not just about orientation, but it's about people deciding to do something together. The first recorded case of same-sex marriage I'm aware of was in 1864. Did I say 1864? Let's go back. It was in AD 64, nearly 2,000 years ago. And that involved the Emperor Nero. He was pretty much mad at the time. It was not approved of. It caused loads of consternation. It had no legal standing. So it wasn't something that entered into the general thinking of anyone in the time the Bible was written, certainly not when the creation story was written. And so any mention of it, positive or negative, would have been strange. And the comment of Jesus was in the context of a question about the grounds for a man to divorce his wife. And in responding to that, there was no reason for Jesus to speak of anything else than the relationship between a man and a woman. The third suggestion is that the creation account refers to how God intended things to be, but that we are now living after the fall, which we get in Genesis 3, and that's had an impact of all of creation, including our relationships. The specific thing that God says about this in Genesis 3, after the fall, is that the relationship between a man and his wife will be damaged. It will not be what it was. And so the argument goes, it's also possible that different expressions of sexuality and associated relationships were not God's original intention, but that they are a consequence of some of the changes introduced after humanity turned away from God. Please do not think I'm suggesting that those with a same-sex attraction or those in a same-sex relationship, for example, are more fallen than others. That's not my point. Rather, each relationship, each person after the fall is flawed and damaged and not as God originally intended. And the call to all believers is to bring our relationship under the authority of Jesus and to ask him to conform them to his good purposes for our lives. So those are some of the options. It's important to think about how we engage with them. And as I say, there'll be an opportunity to discuss that in smaller groups later. Let's move on and think about Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 19:5 says this. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." This is part of a terrible episode in a story where two angels come to Lot's house in Sodom to warn him to escape before God brings judgment on the city. And while there, a crowd of men gather outside and demand that Lot send the angels, who they assumed to be men, to send them outside so that the crowd can have sex with them. Appalled by how this would go against the hospitality a guest would expect to receive in that context, Lot instead offers to send out his 2 virgin daughters to the men. A proposal that is shocking and is so wrong. But that's what happened. I mean, that was what was offered. It didn't actually happen. The angels intervened. They pulled Lot to safety. They struck the mob with blindness. This is nothing to do with same-sex relationship. This is about a mob wanting to engage in gang rape. It's nothing to do with the topic that we're thinking about this afternoon. And a little later on, well, quite a bit later on, Ezekiel reflects on the fate of Sodom. And he makes it clear that their guilt was to do with something else. This was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. That seems to be the thing that God focused on when he reflected on the reasons for Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. So as I said, I don't think this is particularly relevant to our topic, but I wanted to mention it and to cover it briefly. Other views are, of course, available. What I do want us to spend quite a bit of time with is Leviticus 18, which has this statement. Leviticus 18:22. Speaking to men, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. This is one of the most, maybe the most clear statements in the Old Testament about a man being in a sexually intimate relationship with another man. And it clearly states that men should not do this, and that if they do, it is seen to be detestable. And for some people, this brings an end to any conversation, with the conclusion that no form of same-sex engagement can be acceptable to God's people. But I don't think it's quite that clear. And so we're going to spend a bit of time exploring that. Incidentally, the authorized version refers to this being abomination. And this has led some people to refer to those in same-sex relationships as abominations. I want to be clear that this type of language is totally unacceptable. Last week we were reflecting that each person is made in the image of God, to be respected and loved, even if we might disagree with how they are living. As I also mentioned last week, this verse only speaks about men and their relationships with other men. It may simply have been that in the culture at that time there was little interest in what women did, certainly on the part of those who were writing these accounts. Although the next verse does specifically address women's behavior. But it leaves us to have to work out for ourselves whether the same principles spoken about men here should be applied to women. So here are some questions I think we need to think about. To whom were these words given and why? How do they relate to the wider context? And these are always great questions to think about when we're studying any passage of the Bible. Who was it written to? What was it saying? Where does it fit in the bigger story? In this particular case also, what is meant by this word detestable? And what implications does all of this have for us today? So that's our challenge for the next few minutes. To whom were these words given? We go back to the beginning of the chapter. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. You must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you." So the start of the chapter makes very clear to whom these words were spoken. From God to Moses for the people of Israel. So they were for a specific people at a specific time in a specific situation. I am not suggesting they don't have wider applicability. But we need to be careful about simply lifting them from the passage and assuming they apply to us. The end of the chapter, there's a sort of reflection on all that's gone before. There's loads of prohibitions in this chapter. And at the end, we see, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. So there's a list of things the Israelites are not to do, and this is the reason. It is how the people currently living in the land were behaving. And God wanted his people to be different, to show that they were a people set apart for him. So for us, we need to be thinking about what behavior in society around us we think is not acceptable to God, and seek to understand how we should live differently as the people of God. And this is a much wider issue than sexual relationships. And it's not about showing we are better than anyone else. It should never be about that. And one of the reasons behind God's people throughout history being called to live differently is to demonstrate to a watching world what it means to live as part of God's kingdom. And for that to be so attractive that others want to experience it for themselves. It's a gospel issue. And we continually need to be thinking about where living as God's children causes us to demonstrate a different way of living to the people around us. But back to our topic for this afternoon. Most of the prohibitions in Leviticus 18 relate to inappropriate sexual behavior. One referred to child sacrifice in the pursuit of idolatry. Some of the prohibitions are precluded by the laws in our country, while others are seen to be okay. So I think the general principle is that we shouldn't buy into the view in our society that anything is okay in the area of sexual relationships, but we do need to think carefully about how we apply these specifics. Incidentally, some of you, if you were here last Sunday morning, would have heard me referring to the West Wing. In another episode of that series, there's a clip where the president is challenging a radio show host about her condemnation of same-sex relationships, based on this verse in Leviticus. Now, the president in the show is a committed and practicing Roman Catholic who is also a staunch defender of gay rights. And so he takes issue with this particular lady. And he points out that there are other commands in Leviticus that we tend to ignore today, such as not wearing clothes made of different kinds of material. And he lists 3 or 4, and he does it in a very compelling way. And the implication is that if we ignore some, we can ignore others. But there are other commands in Leviticus, such as not perverting justice, that we probably do agree with. And so there's a similar argument that we could make that says, if we agree with that one, we should keep this one as well. So, on this occasion, it is a great clip in the show. I think the argument is too simplistic, as we need to understand the principles, the values behind these commands, the reasons for them, and use that as part of working out how we live today. And one of the ways we can do that is by looking at what is said in the following chapters. Although ultimately, the question is how these ideas are addressed and developed in the New Testament. And that's our topic for next time. So, how does this develop? A couple of chapters later on, Leviticus 20. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. Same word. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. And Leviticus 20 is basically looking again at the restriction 18 and talks about the punishment for ignoring them. And in this particular case, the punishment called for is death for both people involved. And this is still the case in certain countries. But I think we would say this is a terribly wrong response. So as a minimum, we are selective in which of these commands we think are right to apply in our context today. I think we need to recognize that. But it's also helpful to look at how the word detestable is used elsewhere. It's a strong word. We need to think about it. Deuteronomy 14. Do not eat any detestable thing. It's the same word. This is a list of animals that are seen as detestable. Some you might not want to eat, but it includes rabbits and pigs. Some of us do choose to be vegetarian, but very few, I think, would see that eating rabbit or pork as any more detestable than eating any other meat. So, what do we do with that? I think it demonstrates that the word detestable is used in different ways. Here it's being used to talk about ritual cleanness or impurity. A bit further back in Deuteronomy 12, it's got a much more powerful message. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. Here it's speaking about something that is inherently evil, that is morally wrong. So sometimes it's used to speak about something that's to do with their ritual. Sometimes it's used to speak about something that is just morally wrong. And it's used in other ways as well. Deuteronomy 25. Don't have two differing weights in your bag. It goes on to talk about what that means. And it talks about honesty in business. And it says, the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, who deals dishonestly. Here, corrupt a business practice is seen as detestable. But do we sometimes see these activities as victimless crimes? I've heard them referred to in that way, and of less importance than those that affect our personal lives. To illustrate that idea, if one was to take the view that people living in same-sex relationship is wrong, would we feel that more strongly than to say that somebody doing a bit of dodgy dealing at work is as bad, worse, less bad? But the same words are applied. How do we take all that together? I think it is true that the majority of occurrences of this word do seem to relate to things that are normally recognized as morally wrong, often related to idolatry or immorality. But we are not told in what sense this word is being used in Leviticus 18, where it talks about same-sex relationships. And this is, I believe, a key question for us. Is it a moral issue, or is it a ritualistic one, like the prohibition about eating certain meats? Some of the commands in Leviticus 18 are presented as absolutes, with, I think, a moral imperative. Some are presented as avoiding dishonor. Some are presented as ways of preserving the community, which is very important to the people at that time. One, at least, was given to avoid someone going against nature. And so for this command about same-sex activity, it's important for us to try and weigh this up, to assess it for ourselves, to come to a view. These are the types of questions I think we need to wrestle with to avoid simply being selective in our application of these Old Testament verses. There are arguments made against it being a simple moral imperative, arguments that try and take into account the cultural context of the society around, the society that God's people were not to emulate. For example, that there were two types of same-sex activity common in the surrounding culture. One to do with male shrine prostitutes, and the other to do with men being sexually intimate with boys. And the argument goes that it is specifically these that were being spoken against, and so they are the only type of things that need to be avoided. I'm not convinced by those arguments. In the first case, there's a very specific word used in the Bible to refer to shrine prostitutes. They're explicitly barred in Deuteronomy 23:17, but that's not the word used here. And in the second case, the idea of men with boys, with the capital punishment referred to in Deuteronomy 20, it is most likely that what is being spoken about here is consensual between two adult males. Otherwise, it would be exploitation of a minor, and with really no fault you could apply to the younger person involved. On balance, I think it's presented as a moral principle, something we need to take seriously, even as we recognize the original commandment was not written to us or for us. But even if we adopt this view, we need to recognize that we're not calling for the same punishment to be applied, I hope. So as a minimum, we're not being totally consistent in our application of these verses. Whatever view we come to, these verses and the principles behind them do form a backdrop for some of the things we find in the New Testament that I want to look at next time. But it's important to see what these Old Testament passages are saying on their own behalf. So we're going to split into smaller groups or stay on our own to reflect quietly in a moment. And there's some questions for us to consider as we think about that. But before we do that, I wanted to recognize a temptation that I felt strongly earlier this week. As I was reflecting on and praying over these passages, I started thinking about what the implications of any conclusions we come to are, what it says about how we will relate to different people. And that is vitally important, and we will do that. But the temptation I was very much aware of is that can allow ourselves to change what we think about Scripture to help to get to the answers we want in terms of how we relate to other people. And I had to remind myself that I first needed to understand what the Bible says and what it means, and then work through the implications of it. So let's keep that in mind, to seek to understand the Bible first. That's our task for this afternoon. And then some other occasion, we will think through its implications. So, questions I'm going to ask you to think about in these groups relate to those three things. The creation account. What do you think of those different options I suggested? How do you think that all works? Do you agree with me that Sodom and Gomorrah isn't really saying anything about our topic? And how do you engage with these things from the Levitical law? So I have questions for you to think about and to work on. So if you want to split into 3, 4 groups, whatever you feel like, I'll bring some questions around to you.